You always hear people say that the deep woods have a way of swallowing you whole, but you never truly understand what that means until you are standing miles away from civilization, surrounded by ancient trees that block out the moon. My friend David and I had been hiking for 3 days straight, pushing deep into the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Oregon backcountry. We were easily 20 miles away from the nearest paved road, relying entirely on our gear and our legs. We wanted isolation. We wanted to disconnect from the noise of the city. Looking back, that was the biggest mistake of our lives. The temperature had started to drop aggressively as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. It was early November, and the evening air was biting, hovering somewhere around 35 degrees. You could see every breath we took, pluming in the fading light like smoke. We had set up our camp near a dried-up riverbed, surrounded by towering pines that must have been 100 feet tall. I remember feeling a strange, heavy pressure in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the cold, it was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The forest, which had been alive with the typical rustling of small animals and the wind through the branches all afternoon, had gone completely dead. There was an absolute, suffocating silence. I looked over at David, who was struggling to get a fire started. His hands were shaking, and I could tell the sudden silence was getting to him too. We did not exchange many words. The quiet was so absolute that speaking felt like a violation of some unspoken rule of the woods. I stood up to gather some more dead branches just a few dozen feet from our tents, and that was when I felt it. The unmistakable, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. It was an intense burning stare hitting the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight cutting a weak yellow beam through the gathering darkness, but all I saw were the endless twisted trunks of the trees. Yet the feeling did not fade. It grew stronger, wrapping around me like a freezing blanket, warning my instincts that we were no longer alone in that valley. I hurried back to the campfire, clutching a meager handful of kindling. I tossed the wood near the flames and sat down, pulling my jacket tighter against the 30-degree chill that was now biting at my bones. David finally looked up at me, his face pale in the dancing firelight. He asked me if I had felt that strange shift in the air. I nodded, not wanting to voice the rising panic in my throat. We sat there in the oppressive quiet, straining our eyes into the absolute blackness that surrounded our small circle of light. Then came the smell. It did not drift in slowly. It hit us like a physical wall. It was an overpowering, nauseating stench of rotting meat mixed with wet, filthy fur and something sharp, almost like copper or old blood. It was so intense that my eyes began to water, and my stomach convulsed violently. I grabbed my flashlight again, scanning the perimeter of our camp. About 50 feet away, just at the edge of the light's reach, I saw the disturbance in the dirt. I walked over cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pointed the beam at the ground. Pressed deep into the hardened soil was a footprint. It was massive, easily 16 inches long, with deep indentations where massive claws had dug into the earth. It was not shaped like anything I had ever seen. It looked horribly wrong, a grotesque mixture of a canine pad and a distorted, elongated heel. I tracked the beam forward and saw another print, and then another. The stride length between the tracks was terrifying. Whatever had walked past our camp had a stride of at least 6 feet. It was massive, heavy, and bipedal. It had been pacing back and forth just outside our line of sight, studying us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were isolated, completely defenseless, and something gigantic was treating us like subjects in an enclosure. Panic is a strange thing. When it fully takes over, your logical mind shuts down, leaving only the primal urge to flee. We did not bother packing our tents. We grabbed our backpacks, our heavy flashlights, and a single hunting knife I kept on my belt, and we started moving. The plan was to hike back up the eastern ridge, trying to put as many miles between us and that campsite as possible before dawn. We navigated blindly through the dense underbrush, pushing branches out of our faces, our breaths ragged and loud in the freezing night air. We had covered maybe 2 miles, climbing a steep, rocky incline, when he finally showed himself. We had stopped to catch our breath near a massive, uprooted oak tree. I turned my flashlight toward the path ahead, and the beam caught a pair of massive, glowing amber eyes reflecting the light. The beam illuminated a silhouette that defied all logic and sanity. He stepped out from behind a thick cluster of pines, and my entire body locked in pure, paralyzing terror. He was enormous. He stood easily 8 or 9 feet tall on 2 muscular, digitigrade legs. His body was covered in thick, matted black fur, but his anatomy was terrifyingly muscular, with impossibly broad shoulders tapering down to a narrow waist. He had the head of a monstrous wolf, with a long snout and ears pinned back against his skull. But the way he stood, the way his massive arms hung by his sides with long, articulated fingers ending in razor-sharp claws, was disturbing. He was breathing heavily, the steam rising from his dark muzzle into the freezing air. He did not charge. He just stood there, a towering monument of nightmares, blocking our only path forward. My mind could not process the impossible creature standing just 40 feet away. I knew with absolute certainty that if he wanted us dead, we would not even have time to scream. We stumbled backward, entirely consumed by the overwhelming instinct to get away from him. He took a single, heavy step forward, and we bolted in the opposite direction, plunging deeper into the uncharted, treacherous part of the forest. The terrain grew rougher, filled with sharp rocks and hidden roots that threatened to break our ankles with every step. We ran until my lungs felt like they were bleeding, the freezing air burning my throat like swallowed glass. But no matter how fast we ran, he was always there. He was flanking us. I would catch a glimpse of his massive, hulking shadow moving parallel to us through the trees, keeping pace with terrifying ease. He was herding us. Every time we tried to veer left toward the faint trail that led back to civilization, he would appear through the brush, standing tall and imposing, forcing us to turn right. He never closed the distance to attack, but he never let us out of his sight. He was deliberately driving us deeper into the dark, jagged valley that locals always warned hikers to avoid. The exhaustion was severe. We had been running and power hiking for what felt like hours, covering maybe 5 miles of the worst terrain imaginable. My legs were giving out, and David was stumbling beside me, completely out of breath. We were trapped in a twisted game of cat and mouse, being pushed further and further from safety by an apex predator straight out of a nightmare. I was convinced he was just waiting for us to collapse from exhaustion before he moved in to finish us off. He was orchestrating our demise, pushing us into a corner where there would be no chance of escape. The chase finally ended when we broke through a thick wall of brambles and found ourselves standing on the edge of a steep, treacherous drop-off. We had been pushed to the very edge of the deep valley basin. A sheer drop of at least 60 feet of jagged rocks lay directly behind us, and thick, impassable woods surrounded our flanks. We were completely trapped. I pulled my knife, knowing it was entirely useless against a 9-foot-tall monster, but it was the only thing I had. We backed up until our heels were inches from the edge of the cliff. He stepped out from the tree line, his massive frame illuminated by the pale moonlight cutting through the canopy above. He walked slowly, his heavy steps vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. He stopped roughly 20 feet away from us. I braced myself for the end, expecting him to lunge forward and tear us apart. But he didn't. He planted his feet firmly into the dirt, his broad chest heaving. And then he did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He ignored us. He turned his massive, wolf-like head away from David and me and looked out over the deep black expanse of the valley behind us. His ears stood straight up, twitching toward the darkness. The aggressive posture he had used to herd us shifted into something entirely different. His lips pulled back, exposing teeth that were easily 3 inches long, and a deep, rumbling vibration started in his chest. He lowered his center of gravity, gripping the earth with his claws. He wasn't looking at us as prey. He had pushed us to the edge of the cliff to keep us behind him. He was forming a physical barrier between us and the valley. My blood ran ice-cold as I stared into the pitch-black void of the basin below, realizing the ultimate horrifying truth. The Dogman wasn't hunting us. He was preparing to defend himself against something much worse coming up from the darkness. To understand the sheer gravity of this situation, you have to understand exactly where we were and who we are. David and I are not amateurs. We have spent the better part of our 20s navigating the most remote trails the Pacific Northwest has to offer. We grew up near the dense, sprawling forests outside of Portland, spending our weekends carrying heavy packs and pushing our physical limits. We knew how to read the weather, how to track water sources, and how to survive when the temperature plummets, but nothing prepares you for the Blackwood Basin. This is an ancient, untouched stretch of the Oregon wilderness that sits in a permanent shadow. There are no towns nearby. The closest sign of civilization is a decaying logging outpost abandoned decades ago, sitting at least 30 miles to the west. We had specifically chosen this route because we wanted complete isolation, far away from the crowded paths and weekend tourists. We had hiked in entirely on foot, leaving the modern world far behind us. The trees here are gargantuan ancient Douglas firs that reach hundreds of feet into the sky, their thick canopies blocking out the sun even at noon. The ground is a treacherous mix of sharp rocks, thick moss, and deep, unpredictable ravines. It is a place that feels untouched by time, a hostile environment that clearly does not welcome human presence. Standing on that cliff, with the temperature dropping toward a bitter 25 degrees Fahrenheit, the reality of our isolation crushed down on me. There was no backup. There was no radio signal. We were entirely alone in a dark, frozen wilderness, sharing the edge of a cliff with a creature straight out of our worst nightmares. The atmosphere around us was thick with an unnatural dread. The cold was no longer just a weather condition. It felt like a living entity trying to seep into our bones. The wind had completely died down, leaving an oppressive, heavy stillness in the air. You could smell the raw ancient earth, a mixture of decaying pine needles and damp soil, but it was entirely overpowered by the foul, stinging odor radiating from the massive beast standing just yards away from us. It was a scent of predatory dominance, a mixture of wet, unwashed fur and something metallic that made my eyes water. The darkness in the forest was absolute. Without the moon fighting to pierce the dense canopy, we were completely blind to our surroundings, relying only on the weak, flickering beams of our flashlights. I remember feeling a profound sense of psychological horror, a deep-seated realization that we had willingly walked into an environment where we were completely powerless. The sheer scale of the woods around us felt suffocating. Every towering tree and every jagged rock formation seemed to close in on us, amplifying the terror. We were trapped in a vast, dark arena, miles away from any form of safety, exposed to the brutal elements and whatever was waiting in the pitch-black basin below. I looked over at David. We did not exchange any words. We did not need to. The sheer horror etched into his face mirrored exactly what I was feeling. His heavy winter coat was torn from our frantic run through the brambles, and he was clutching his walking stick with white knuckles. The silence was agonizing. In a normal forest, there is a constant symphony of background noise. You hear insects, small animals shifting in the underbrush, or the distant rustling of leaves. But here, on the edge of the Blackwood Basin, the silence was absolute and terrifying. It was a predatory silence, the kind of quiet that falls over an environment when every living creature knows that something deadly is nearby. I realized then that the stories we had heard growing up, The frightening tales about hikers vanishing without a trace were not just local myths, they were warnings. The native tribes of this region had always avoided this specific valley, calling it a place of bad medicine, a cursed depression in the earth where the natural order was broken. We had arrogantly ignored the history of this land, treating the wilderness as a playground rather than a hostile territory. Now shivering in the freezing cold, staring at the back of a 9-foot-tall bipedal wolf, the arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a primal, overwhelming instinct to simply survive the night. The physical presence of the Dogman was something my brain simply refused to accept. Even as he stood there, his back turned to us, the sheer mass of the creature was paralyzing. His dark fur absorbed the faint moonlight, making him look like a solid shadow torn from the darkest corner of the woods. The musculature on his back shifted with every heavy breath he took, powerful and tense, ready for explosive violence. I could see the sharp, jagged outline of his tufted ears straining forward, catching sounds from the deep valley that our human ears could not register. His long, clawed fingers flexed rhythmically by his sides, digging deep grooves into the frozen dirt. The way he moved, even in a static defensive stance, was entirely predatory and fluid. He was not a deformed animal or a trick of the light. He was a perfect, lethal apex predator, perfectly adapted to this hostile environment. Yet the most terrifying aspect was his behavior. He had deliberately spared us. He had gone out of his way to herd us to this specific elevated position, placing himself between us and the unseen threat. The psychological horror of that realization was staggering. If a creature capable of tearing a grown man to pieces in seconds was bracing itself for a fight, what kind of monstrosity was crawling up from the darkness of the basin? The temperature seemed to drop even further, hovering near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing the sweat on my forehead. My legs ached intensely from the miles we had covered, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me anchored to the spot. We were entirely cornered on that cliff edge, a 60-foot drop behind us, and an impossible monster standing guard in front of us. I strained my eyes, trying to see past his massive silhouette into the dense black void of the valley. The shadows seemed to twist and contort in the gloom. The sense of impending doom was suffocating. Every muscle in my body was locked tight, waiting for the attack, waiting for whatever was lurking in the depths to reveal itself. The Dogman remained completely motionless, his amber eyes fixed intently on the tree line below, his entire body radiating aggressive tension. The horror of the situation was complete and absolute. We were no longer hikers exploring the beautiful Oregon woods. We were trapped spectators in a brutal ancient war between apex predators, miles from civilization, with absolutely no way out. We could only stand there in the freezing darkness, holding our breath, waiting for the nightmare to unfold. The tension on that cliff edge was thick enough to choke us. We were standing with our heels practically hanging off the 60-foot drop, completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of our situation. The temperature had plummeted even further, easily dropping down to a bitter 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the biting cold was cutting through my heavy winter jacket like a knife. But the freezing weather was the absolute least of our concerns. The 9-foot-tall monster, standing just 20 feet in front of us, commanded every ounce of our terrified attention. He was completely focused on the dark tree line below, his massive, heavily muscled back facing us. The silence in the Blackwood Basin was agonizing, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against my eardrums. It was the kind of absolute stillness that happens right before a devastating natural disaster strikes. I could see the thick black fur on the creature's spine standing straight up, forming a rigid ridge down his back. His broad, muscular shoulders were tense, and his massive hands, tipped with claws that were at least 4 inches long, continuously flexed and dug deep into the frozen soil. The sheer size of him was mind-bending. He looked like an ancient deity of the forest, an apex predator perfectly built for immense physical violence, yet he was completely, entirely still, waiting for whatever was lurking in the valley below. The psychological torture of that waiting period was indescribable. Every second stretched into an eternity. I wanted to close my eyes and pray for it to end, but the primal fear kept my eyes glued to the dark abyss ahead. I knew that if I looked away for even a fraction of a second, death would rise from that darkness and take us all. David was standing right beside me, completely rigid, his breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. We were absolutely helpless. Two insignificant intruders caught in the middle of a territorial war between monsters that science claims do not exist. Then, the absolute silence of the woods was violently broken, not by a voice, but by the physical destruction of the forest itself. Down in the basin, perhaps 100 yards away, the tops of the massive pine trees began to sway violently. There was zero wind in the air, yet these towering trees, some of them easily 2 feet thick, were being violently pushed aside by something moving through the dense underbrush. The movement was slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. We could feel the deep rhythmic vibrations traveling through the ground, traveling up the 60-foot rock face, and vibrating right through the soles of our boots. Whatever was coming up from the valley floor carried an immense, unimaginable weight. The Dogman immediately reacted to the vibrations, his ears pinned flat against his skull, and he lowered his center of gravity even further, dropping into a deep, aggressive crouch. He dragged his massive claws across the rocky ground, carving deep trenches into the earth, establishing a firm anchor point for an impending physical clash. The terrifying part was that he was backing up slightly, giving ground, moving an inch or two closer to us. This gigantic, nightmarish wolf creature was actually calculating his defensive position, and the realization that he was being cautious sent a wave of pure, concentrated terror straight through my heart. If this 9-foot-tall beast was showing signs of strategic caution, the entity approaching us had to be something of apocalyptic proportions. I strained my eyes into the pitch-black darkness, gripping my useless hunting knife so hard that my knuckles turned completely white, but the dense shadows of the basin concealed the approaching nightmare. All we could do was track its progress by the violent thrashing of the ancient trees and the heavy, earth-shaking impacts that were slowly closing the distance toward our elevated ridge. As the unseen entity closed the distance to roughly 50 yards, the atmosphere changed completely. The heavy, musky scent of wet fur and copper that radiated from the Dogman was suddenly and violently overpowered by a new, suffocating odor. It rolled up the ridge like a toxic fog, hitting the back of my throat and causing my stomach to convulse violently. It was the smell of ancient, stagnant decay, like unearthing a mass grave that had been sealed for a century. It smelled of rotting fungi, stagnant swamp water, and an intense chemical bitterness that made my eyes water profusely. The stench was so physically offensive that I had to pull the collar of my jacket over my nose just to keep from vomiting. The Dogman clearly hated it too. He began to shake his massive head, exhaling aggressively through his snout to clear the vile scent from his senses. He began to pace back and forth along the boundary line he had drawn in the dirt, his amber eyes burning intensely in the darkness. The pacing was not erratic. It was a calculated, tactical movement, ensuring that his massive body remained squarely between us and the path leading up from the valley. I realized in that horrifying moment that we were not just collateral damage in this encounter. We were the objective. The thing coming up the ridge was hunting us, and the Dogman had intercepted it. The sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to break my sanity. We had spent our entire lives believing that humanity was at the top of the food chain, but standing on that freezing cliff in the Oregon wilderness, I understood that we were absolutely nothing but fragile prey. The darkness below us seemed to physically thicken, swirling and condensing as the heavy rhythmic vibrations brought the unseen nightmare closer and closer to our fragile position. The entity stopped moving when it reached the base of our steep incline, roughly 30 yards below our position. The violent swaying of the trees ceased, and a horrifying heavy stillness returned to the Blackwood Basin. But this silence was vastly different. It was highly charged, thick with predatory anticipation. The Dogman stopped his pacing immediately. He planted himself at the very edge of the steep drop-off, his massive legs braced like stone pillars. He thrust his broad chest forward, and the muscles in his arms bulged with terrifying tension. He was issuing a silent, physical challenge. He did not make a single sound, but his entire posture was a violent declaration of war. The sheer physical dominance he projected was staggering to witness. He was completely focused, his amber eyes locked onto a specific point in the dark foliage below. For several long, agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The standoff was a test of wills between two apex predators, calculating the risk of an upward assault against a fortified defender. My heart was hammering against my ribs so violently that I thought my chest was going to fracture. I was desperately trying to control my breathing, terrified that even the slightest noise from David or me would break the fragile tension and trigger the assault. The cold wind whipped across the exposed cliff, dropping the temperature even further, but I was sweating profusely beneath my layers of clothing. We were completely trapped in an agonizing purgatory, watching a monumental clash of natural titans unfold in absolute silence. The boundary line had been established, and the entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see which of these unimaginable nightmares would make the first move. The tension finally broke when the heavy, rotting stench suddenly intensified, indicating that the entity at the base of the ridge had made its decision. The ground began to vibrate again, but this time the rhythm was much faster and vastly more aggressive. The entity was not just walking anymore. It was charging up the steep 60-foot incline directly toward our position. The sound of massive boulders being dislodged and heavy tree trunks being violently pushed aside echoed up the slope. The sheer power required to charge up such a steep, treacherous incline at that speed was utterly incomprehensible. The Dogman reacted instantly. He did not retreat a single inch. Instead, he leaned forward over the edge of the drop-off, his long arms extending downward, his massive claws fully extended and ready to strike. The amber glow of his eyes narrowed into slits of pure, concentrated fury. The vibrations grew violently intense, shaking the very ground beneath my boots, threatening to throw us off balance and send us plummeting over the edge. I could finally see the dense brush at the edge of the cliff being violently torn apart from the bottom up. Something impossibly huge, obscured by the pitch-black shadows, was aggressively tearing its way up the final 20 feet of the rock face. The Dogman braced his legs, his entire body coiling like a massive dark spring, preparing to intercept the enormous weight that was about to breach the top of the ridge. I instinctively grabbed David by the shoulder and dragged him a few inches further back, our heels teetering dangerously over the sheer drop behind us. The climax of this horrifying nightmare was officially upon us, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The edge of the cliff suddenly gave way as an enormous, decaying hand slammed into the frozen soil just inches from the Dogman's massive paws. The fingers were impossibly long, pale, and devoid of any hair or warmth, ending in thick, hardened bone spurs rather than typical claws. As the entity hauled its horrifying weight over the edge, the putrid stench of ancient rot became so suffocating that my vision began to blur. The creature that pulled itself up from the Blackwood Basin defied every law of nature and biology. It was exceptionally tall, easily surpassing the Dogman's 9 feet, perhaps reaching 10 or 11 feet in height, but its anatomy was grotesquely emaciated. Its pale grey skin was pulled incredibly tight over a skeletal frame, revealing every jagged rib and distorted joint. It did not move like a natural animal. Its limbs bent at impossible, horrifying angles, suggesting multiple joints where there should only be one. The most terrifying aspect of this monstrosity was its complete lack of a face. Where eyes, a nose, and a typical mouth should have been, there was only a sunken vertical fissure, lined with rows of jagged, translucent teeth that dripped a dark, viscous fluid onto the earth. The Dogman did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. As soon as the pale abomination breached the boundary line, the massive wolf creature launched a devastating forward assault. The sheer physical force of the collision between these two titans sent a violent shockwave through the ground, vibrating right through the thick soles of my hiking boots. The Dogman used his overwhelming muscular bulk to ram the skeletal entity, wrapping his massive clawed hands around its narrow torso to prevent it from advancing past the cliff's edge. The two nightmarish figures became a chaotic, swirling mass of black fur and pale, decaying flesh, completely illuminated by the faint, silvery moonlight piercing through the dense canopy above. I was frozen in absolute terror, unable to move my legs, unable to look away from the catastrophic violence unfolding just 15 feet away from where David and I stood. We were entirely trapped, pressed against the fatal drop behind us, forced to witness a brutal, primitive war between a guardian we never asked for and an ancient horror that wanted to consume us. The temperature plummeted further, the air growing thick with the metallic scent of fresh blood mingling with the nauseating odor of decay. The violence displayed was highly visceral and utterly terrifying to witness. The Dogman fought with a calculated, heavily practiced brutality, utilizing his immense upper body strength to control the center of the conflict. He continuously drove his broad shoulders into the pale entity's chest, forcing it backward toward the 60-foot drop. However, the skeletal creature possessed an unnatural, terrifying agility. It contorted its elongated limbs in sickening ways, wrapping its pale, bony arms around the Dogman's thick neck and digging its bone spurs deep into the heavy black fur. Dark, heavy blood began to fly through the freezing air, staining the pristine frost on the ground in vast, dark patches. Despite suffering deep, agonizing lacerations to his shoulders and back, the Dogman refused to yield a single inch of ground. Every time the pale monstrosity tried to maneuver around him to reach David and me, the massive wolf creature would violently reposition his bulk, physically blocking the path. The skeletal entity lashed out with remarkable speed, its vertical jaw snapping aggressively, trying to secure a fatal grip on the Dogman's throat. The physical exertion of both creatures created a thick cloud of steam in the 15-degree air, obscuring their chaotic movements in a shroud of freezing mist. I watched in absolute paralyzing horror as the Dogman caught one of the entity's incoming strikes, gripping its pale, emaciated wrist with his massive, clawed hand. With a brutal, twisting motion, the Dogman applied an immense amount of leverage, attempting to break the skeletal limb. The sheer power required to manipulate a creature of that size was entirely incomprehensible to my human mind. The pale entity retaliated by thrashing its entire body, using its bizarre weight distribution to throw the Dogman slightly off balance. For a brief, terrifying moment, the boundary line was broken. The Dogman stumbled backward, his heavy boots carving deep trenches into the soil, and the pale abomination saw its opening. The skeletal nightmare immediately shifted its focus away from the massive wolf and locked its faceless, terrifying head directly onto our fragile human position. The realization that the entity had bypassed its primary obstacle and was now focused entirely on us sent a surge of pure, unadulterated panic straight into my core. The pale monstrosity dropped onto all fours, moving with an erratic, spider-like coordination that made my stomach aggressively turn. It covered the distance with terrifying speed, its vertical, tooth-filled maw opening wide, exposing a dark, rotting throat that radiated the stench of death. It was less than 10 feet away, and I knew with complete certainty that David and I were about to be torn to pieces. I raised my useless hunting knife, my hands shaking violently, completely aware that the small blade would do absolutely nothing against a 10-foot-tall horror. But the Dogman was not defeated. Before the skeletal creature could close the final few yards, a massive black-furred arm shot out from the freezing mist. The Dogman's enormous hand clamped down onto the entity's pale ankle, with a grip that looked capable of crushing solid steel. The sheer momentum of the wolf creature's counterattack was staggering. He did not just pull the entity back, he violently hauled the entire 10-foot monstrosity off the ground, using his immense core strength to swing the creature backward in a massive, brutal arc. The pale entity flailed wildly, its bone spurs slashing through the empty air as it was dragged away from us by brute force. The Dogman slammed the skeletal horror onto the hard, frozen earth with devastating impact, immediately placing one of his massive digitigrade feet directly onto the creature's narrow chest to pin it down. The intelligence displayed by the Dogman in that specific moment was the most terrifying and awe-inspiring thing I had ever witnessed. He was not operating on blind animalistic rage. He was highly tactical, fully aware of his surroundings, and entirely dedicated to keeping that abomination away from the two helpless humans cowering on the cliff edge. He was acting as a deliberate, calculated barrier, absorbing immense physical damage to ensure we remained untouched by the rotting horror that had crawled out of the Blackwood Basin. The pale entity refused to stay pinned. It contorted its spine in a highly unnatural, sickening arch, generating enough leverage to dislodge the Dogman's heavy foot. The skeletal creature scrambled backward, completely desperate to regain its footing, but the Dogman was relentless. He lunged forward, closing the distance in a fraction of a second, his jaws opening wide to expose massive 3-inch canines. The wolf creature clamped his jaws directly onto the entity's pale shoulder, violently shaking his massive head to cause maximum structural damage. The physical struggle pushed them perilously close to the exact spot where David and I were huddled. The sheer size of their bodies pressing against us forced us to press our backs entirely against the sharp brambles at the very edge of the fatal drop. I could feel the intense radiating heat coming off the Dogman's muscular back, contrasting violently with the freezing 15-degree air. I could clearly see the deep, bleeding gashes across his dark fur, injuries he had sustained purely to protect us. The pale entity thrashed violently, managing to tear its shoulder free from the Dogman's powerful jaws, leaving a gaping black wound in its pale flesh. In a final desperate attempt, the skeletal creature swung its elongated arm in a wide sweeping arc, completely ignoring the Dogman and aiming directly for my head. The attack was incredibly fast, a blur of pale skin and jagged bone spurs cutting through the frosty air. Time seemed to slow down entirely. I could clearly see the disgusting, translucent texture of the entity's flesh, the dark fluid dripping from its claws, and the total lack of any facial features as its terrifying head loomed within 20 inches of my face. The nauseating stench of ancient rot completely enveloped me, suffocating my lungs and freezing my heart in pure terror. I tightly closed my eyes, fully expecting the fatal impact, knowing there was absolutely nowhere left to dodge, entirely trapped between a nightmare and a 60-foot drop into the absolute darkness below. The fatal blow never connected with me. Instead, an immense wave of physical force violently displaced the air right in front of my face. I opened my eyes just in time to see the Dogman intercepting the attack with his own heavily muscled forearm. The bone spurs of the pale entity dug deeply into the wolf creature's flesh, but the Dogman did not flinch. He used the skeletal creature's extended arm as leverage, grabbing the entity by the throat and the waist simultaneously. With a final, monumental surge of raw physical power, the Dogman drove his legs deeply into the frozen dirt and charged forward like an unstoppable freight train. He bulldozed the pale monstrosity backward, pushing it across the remaining few yards of the cliff's surface. The entity thrashed and violently clawed at the Dogman's chest, completely desperate to anchor itself to the ground, but the sheer momentum of the massive wolf was overwhelming. They reached the very edge of the 60-foot drop-off. The loose rocks and frozen soil crumbled beneath their immense combined weight. For a terrifying, suspended second, both creatures teetered on the brink of the absolute void. The Dogman then executed a highly calculated maneuver, violently twisting his heavy torso and releasing his grip, transferring all of his forward momentum directly into the pale creature, while throwing his own weight backward onto solid ground. The skeletal entity lost its footing entirely, its elongated limbs grasping frantically at the empty, freezing air. I watched as the horrifying pale abomination tumbled backward over the edge of the cliff, swallowed instantly by the pitch-black shadows of the Blackwood Basin. The heavy, sickening impact of its massive body hitting the jagged rocks 60 feet below echoed up the canyon walls moments later, followed by absolute, complete silence. The Dogman remained standing precisely on the edge of the precipice, his massive chest heaving violently, thick steam pouring from his jaws into the freezing night. He was severely injured, his dark fur slick with dark blood, but he stood completely victorious. The ultimate guardian of the forest had defended his territory, and in doing so, he had saved our lives from an unimaginable doom. The absolute silence that fell over the Blackwood Basin was heavier than any sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. The terrifying pale abomination was gone, swallowed by the pitch-black abyss 60 feet below us, and the violent clash of natural titans had abruptly ended. The only thing breaking the complete stillness of the freezing night was the aggressive, labored breathing of the massive creature standing at the edge of the precipice. The temperature had settled around a bitter 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and thick columns of steam poured from the Dogman's dark snout with every massive exhalation. He stood there with his broad, muscular back facing us, staring down into the dark valley to ensure the threat was permanently neutralized. I remained frozen against the sharp brambles, completely paralyzed by the profound shock of what we had just witnessed. My mind was completely incapable of processing the sheer magnitude of the situation. We had been entirely defenseless, reduced to fragile prey, caught in the crossfire of ancient biological warfare, and yet we were completely unharmed. The physical toll of the battle on the Dogman was extensively visible in the pale moonlight. Deep, severe lacerations crisscrossed his massive shoulders and thick back, courtesy of the skeletal entity's jagged bone spurs. Thick, dark blood matted his black fur, dripping slowly onto the frosted earth and freezing almost instantly. Despite the immense trauma he had sustained, his posture never wavered. He remained a towering monument of apex dominance, his massive digitigrade legs planted firmly on the jagged rocks, his sharp claws still gripping the earth with unimaginable strength. The sheer power required to violently throw a 10-foot-tall monstrosity over a cliff edge was entirely beyond human comprehension. Yet he had executed the maneuver with calculated precision. David was shivering uncontrollably beside me, his eyes wide and completely vacant, entirely broken by the psychological trauma of the last hour. We did not speak. We did not dare to even shift our weight. The instinctual fear of drawing the massive wolf creature's attention kept us anchored to the spot. We were acutely aware that although he had just defended us from an unimaginable horror, he was still a 9-foot-tall apex predator, fully capable of tearing us apart in a fraction of a second. The boundary line he had drawn in the dirt was still there, a physical manifestation of the absolute separation between our fragile human world and the dark, unforgiving wilderness he commanded. We were merely trespassers who had been granted a temporary, inexplicable reprieve. After several long, agonizing minutes of absolute stillness, the Dogman finally shifted his weight. The heavy, rhythmic movement of his massive muscles sent a fresh wave of primal terror straight through my chest. He slowly turned his enormous wolf-like head away from the dark basin and looked directly over his broad shoulder at us. The moment his amber eyes locked onto mine, the atmosphere shifted entirely. I expected to see the mindless, bloodthirsty rage of a wild animal, but what I saw was infinitely more terrifying. His eyes held an ancient, profound intelligence. It was a conscious, calculating awareness that completely shattered every scientific boundary known to mankind. He was evaluating us, studying our terrified, fragile forms shivering in the freezing cold. There was no aggression in his posture anymore, just a heavy, exhausting burden. He understood exactly what he had just done, and he understood how entirely helpless we were. He stared at us for what felt like an eternity, his amber eyes burning intensely through the freezing mist. It was a silent, powerful communication, an unspoken warning that we did not belong in his territory and that we needed to leave immediately. The putrid, suffocating stench of the pale entity began to dissipate on the freezing wind, leaving only the heavy, musky scent of wet fur and fresh blood. The dogman finally broke the eye contact. He turned his massive body fully away from the cliff edge, his movements slightly sluggish from the severe injuries he had sustained. He did not drop onto all fours. He walked upright, taking slow, heavy bipedal strides toward the thickest part of the ancient timber. Every step he took vibrated through the frozen ground, a constant reminder of his immense, overwhelming size. We watched in absolute silence as his towering dark silhouette seamlessly blended into the dense black shadows of the towering pines, completely disappearing into the unforgiving wilderness. He left no trace of his departure, other than the massive 16-inch footprints carved deeply into the frosted dirt and the dark patches of blood marking his victorious defense. He was gone, returning to the shadows to continue his eternal watch over the cursed boundaries of the Blackwood Basin. The moment the dogman disappeared into the darkness, the paralyzing grip of fear slightly loosened, replaced instantly by the desperate, overwhelming instinct to survive. The temperature was still dropping, hovering near a dangerous 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and we were miles away from any form of safety. We had abandoned our camping gear, our shelter, and our supplies during the initial chase. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs, weak flashlights with fading batteries, and a useless hunting knife. The journey out of the Oregon backcountry was a brutal, agonizing test of human endurance. We immediately turned away from the cliff edge and began walking eastward, strictly maintaining a rapid, forced pace to generate enough body heat to prevent severe hypothermia. The terrain was incredibly hostile, an endless expanse of sharp rocks, hidden roots, and dense, thorny underbrush that continuously tore at our heavy jackets. We walked for miles in complete, unbroken silence. The psychological trauma of the night heavily weighed on our minds, constantly manifesting as profound paranoia. Every shadow cast by our fading flashlights looked like a twisted skeletal limb. Every shift of the freezing wind against the pine needles sounded like heavy, bipedal footsteps tracking us through the dark. We pushed our bodies entirely past their physical limits. Blisters formed and ruptured on our feet, and the severe cold aggressively bit at our exposed faces and hands, threatening permanent tissue damage. We walked for 20 solid hours without stopping to rest, driven entirely by the primal fear that the pale monstrosity had somehow survived the 60-foot drop, or worse, that there were others lurking in the dark timber. Dehydration and immense physical fatigue caused my vision to constantly blur, but we refused to stop. We navigated strictly by the sun once it finally rose, keeping our heading locked toward civilization. The vast towering trees of the deep woods felt like prison bars, keeping us trapped in a hostile environment where humans were nothing more than fragile, insignificant prey waiting to be consumed by ancient forces. It took us 3 full days of brutal, uninterrupted hiking to finally breach the tree line and spot the distant welcome lights of a small, isolated logging town. We had covered over 30 miles of the most treacherous terrain imaginable on foot, surviving entirely on melting snow and sheer, concentrated willpower. When we finally walked onto the paved surface of the main highway, my legs completely gave out. I collapsed onto the cold asphalt, staring up at the clear night sky, completely unable to process the fact that we had actually survived. We walked another 5 miles down the highway until we reached a small diner, where the locals immediately called for medical assistance due to our severe state of exposure and exhaustion. We never reported the actual events of that night to the local authorities. We fabricated a story about getting lost and losing our gear in a sudden rock slide. We knew exactly what would happen if we tried to explain that a 9-foot-tall bipedal wolf had defended us from a 10-foot-tall, faceless, skeletal abomination. We would be subjected to intense psychiatric evaluations, labeled as completely insane and permanently locked away in a facility. The truth of the Blackwood Basin is a secret that the modern world is completely unequipped to handle. The physical injuries eventually healed. The frostbite on my fingers recovered, and the deep blisters on my feet turned into thick calluses, but the psychological scars are entirely permanent. David and I rarely speak anymore. The shared trauma is simply too heavy, a constant, suffocating reminder of the absolute horror we experienced. I cannot sleep without leaving every light in my house turned on, and the mere scent of wet fur or stagnant water sends me into severe panic attacks. The arrogant belief that humanity sits comfortably at the top of the food chain was violently beaten out of me on that freezing cliff edge. We are completely blind to the ancient, terrifying wars constantly being waged in the dark, uncharted corners of the world. As time passes, I constantly reflect on the immense, terrifying scale of the wilderness. The deep woods do not belong to us. They are a highly contested battleground for ancient biological nightmares that entirely defy human logic and scientific classification. The entity that crawled up from the pitch-black depths of that valley was a creature of pure, unadulterated malice, an abomination driven entirely by the instinct to consume and destroy. If it had managed to bypass the boundary line, David and I would have been violently erased from existence, becoming just 2 more missing persons statistics permanently lost in the Pacific Northwest. But the most profound and terrifying truth is the existence of the Dogman. He is not a mindless monster wandering the timber looking for human prey. He is a guardian. He is the ancient, brutal warden of the forest, specifically adapted to combat the unimaginable horrors that lurk in the darkest depressions of the earth. He aggressively herds fragile humans away from extreme danger, standing as a towering, heavily muscled barrier between our fragile existence and complete violent annihilation. The sheer thought that something as terrifying as a 9-foot-tall bipedal wolf is a necessary evil to keep worse things at bay is a concept that permanently shatters any sense of worldly security. So, the next time you decide to venture deep into the isolated wilderness, miles away from civilization, pay close attention to your surroundings. If the forest goes completely silent, the temperature violently drops, and you smell the intense, musky scent of wet fur, do not ignore your instincts. Turn around and walk away immediately. He might just be watching you, ensuring you do not cross a boundary line you were never meant to cross. Thank you for tuning in to this terrifying confession here on Mr. Nightmare Scares You. The woods hold secrets that are infinitely darker than we can possibly imagine, and these Dogman encounters and true scary stories prove that we are never truly alone in the dark. If this story sent a chill down your spine and made you question what hides in the shadows, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment below sharing your own terrifying tales or unexplainable events, and share this video with someone who loves true horror. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss a trip into the unknown. Stay safe, stay out of the deep woods, and I will see you in the next nightmare.